All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the talk. I don't think this was this the title that was in the book? I don't think so. This is the title I actually like. I like talking about the straight dope. It reminds me of like Welcome Back, Carter or something like that. That's the bit.ly URL there. That's actually, can you guys see that in the back? Yeah? The backpack? In my age group? Yeah? Okay, good. That bit.ly URL points to this slide. This slide deck is hosted. It's a JS Revealed talk. That's me. That's all the places you can find me. Any Ingress players in the room? I can't believe so few Ingress players in the room that I've ever met. And that's also my email address now at Red Hat, the steve0@redhat.com. Okay? Let's go through the agenda. Oh, stop telling me things are happening. So the agenda is microservices, pros and cons. How many of you are actually using microservices here? Excellent, just like one or two. And that's why you're here, right? And so this talk is going to be very different than most of your other microservices talk. I'm not going to try to convince you to use microservices. And I'm not going to tell you that you're not using Akka, so you're all a bunch of idiots, right? Or you're not using Node.js, so you don't know what you're doing, right? Make you feel bad. That is not the point of this talk. Okay, we're going to try to see it in action, and that's it. So it's a very little agenda. The two assumptions are you understand the web, so you understand HTTP post and GET and stuff like that, and you've written a web application with back-end services even if it was a demo app. Has everybody done that? How many of you are, this is DevNation, so I'm assuming there's less ops people. How many of you are ops people? One. And also a developer? Yeah. My condolences. All right, so the other thing that you should understand, in case you haven't been able to tell so far, I'm a very informal presenter. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Or if you have some feedback about something you've done, raise your hand. Or if I ask a question, I'm expecting you to answer. Not all at once. But I like answers because it gives me feedback as well, okay? So I'm going to give you the background about my microservices adventure. No, this is not, well, after you see me trying to get the demo running, you might think this represents my adventure, but it doesn't. What this actually represents is why I'm really fortunate being a dev advocate, evangelist at Red Hat, in that on the OpenShift team, we're allowed space to write applications, like full applications, right? It's not just samples, but like a full app, so we know what it feels like and we can talk with somewhat of authority. I'm actually an ecologist by training. My PhD is in ecology. And I'm really interested in the phenomena of roadkill. And not for eating, not for culinary purposes. The idea is, that came up to me. I did some environmental consulting on wind turbines. Everybody know the big wind turbines? And they're really good at producing electricity, but the old models are really also good at doing what? Killing birds. Exactly. So I worked on the Altamont ones. So if anybody who's in the San Francisco area, when you drive out over East Bay, there's a whole set of wind turbines, and they were killing eagles and owls and all sorts of stuff. And everybody was up in arms about it. How dare they kill an eagle, you can't get a take permit, blah, 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 all this stuff. And I was thinking about it, and then I started paying attention to roadkill, and I started reading articles on fatalities due to roadkill. It turns out we kill way more birds with buildings and cars than we ever do at the Altamont. But most people don't think about it. And the reason why is it's called non-point source, right? How many of you remember point source pollution when you took your environmental studies class? Does anybody remember it? No? Okay, you didn't think you'd be learning this, but here you are. Point source pollution is that pipe that runs right into the river, right? Or that smokestack. You say, oh, that's what's causing all the pollution. Those are bad people, right? Because they're doing this. Non-point source is when all of us Americans, especially in the Northeast and in California, have lawns and we put pesticides and we put fertilizers all over our lawns. It runs off of everybody's lawn into the river and kills all the fish, but it's non-point source, so everybody feels fine. They're like, oh, those bad polluters with the pipe. I'm okay, right? And non-point usually is a much bigger problem. And so I was trying to write an application that was the Waze app, crowdsourcing for roadkill. Okay? What? To kill them? Yes, to find the animals more efficiently so people could hit them more. No, to try to... Thank you, Grant. Yeah, you can see how our team is run. With my wind turbines, I got to take out more. No, the point was to raise awareness. I don't think most people, how many of you think about animals that you kill on a regular basis with your car? Not that you always kill animals, but how many of you think about how many animals are actually killed with cars? probably nobody thinks about it that much, except for the women in the back. But most people don't think about it that much. And so the point of this was you could pop up the app and see, oh my gosh, roads are carnage, right? And then get people to think about things like overpasses and underpasses so that we don't do as much. Because no one goes out and finds somebody if they hit a golden eagle with a car. You don't have to get a take. Anyway, so that's the background to why I built this app. And I was building it relatively recently, so I was like, hey, this microservices thing, so this is about 2 years ago, this microservices thing is pretty hot. Why don't I actually try to build one to see what it actually feels like to build one, right? Because it's always easy to read the papers and the web pages, and everybody's saying, oh, then you watch Adrian Crockford give his speech, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've got to do this. And then you actually use it, and it's completely something different, Java EE. So this is the architecture I used. I went with a very simple one, right? So I don't have to use microservices here. I chose it as a learning experience. And it's a pretty simple architecture. Unfortunately, in Reveal.js, I can't make the picture bigger. But what you can see is there's a phone and a main web interface, and these each talk to an individual service, right? I don't have the web app or the mobile app will talk directly to the service. Okay, there's no one web page that is brokering all the rest, and it's not one monolithic app behind it. There is a service for data entry. So that's when someone hits or sees an animal, they can say, oh, I saw this dead animal here. There's the user service, so that manages the user. And because we're hip and happening and you want to gamify everything, there's a game service, right? So just like Waze, you go drive around and you get a piece of candy and you feel really good about yourself because you drove that road. This would give you awards when you specify a certain number of animals that you've seen or something like that, right? And a lot of microservices talk about a data store per service. In this case, I didn't feel like I needed it, right? It's just me working on the team. So all of this is talking into a PostgreSQL, PostGIS database on the back end. They all talk into the same database, but they don't, each of the services talk to different parts of the schema, right? It was very hard for me not to have my brain as I was typing it, I wanted the service to update, I wanted the data entry service to update the user table when something, and I was like, no, I've got to send a message back out and do it. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And then for messaging, one of the things you do with microservices is loosely couple. And so for messaging, just like AMQ, I'm using IronMQ. That's messaging as a service, okay? So that's the pretty simple architecture, right? Everybody can get their head around that? Okay. Nobody has any questions? Okay. So excuse me while I fire up this demo. Bonus points for whoever what scene is that? In what movie? Blazing Saddles. So do you get now the reference, excuse me while I fire up this demo? Do you remember that scene in the movie? If you have not seen it, that whole scene where he comes into town is great. So this microservice, I'm actually using a BlazeMeter to test it. How many of you have heard of BlazeMeter? A couple of you, great. This is more than last year. So BlazeMeter is a JMeter as a service. How many of you have heard of JMeter? Almost everybody, right? And so this says you don't have to worry about standing up the servers. You don't have to worry about scaling up the servers. I basically just take my JMX file, upload it, and tell it to go. And I want this many users, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. And it was much easier to set it up, and this is how I'm going to use it to drive my service. I can't actually show you what's in it because the configuration is just a JMX file. But what it's basically doing is hitting a bunch of the service endpoints with both gets and posts. Right? So the services look like this. This is like the data entry service. Right? So I'm getting back a bunch of the kills. So just some simple JSON. Here's the game service, so here's the awards. Right? As soon as you join, I'm going to say, well done, you've completed sign up, and you get an award. Woohoo, you get a badge. Makes people excited. They feel special. Contributor, you submitted your first, right? So there's a bunch of awards that I can put in, and that's the service for that. And let's see if this actually works now. No. All right, so my bug fixing at the last minute did not work. So this is the down service. This will be great because we can actually see what happens with a microservice when part of the app is down. I did it on purpose. We'll see if it actually works. So let's go ahead and start the test. And this takes a while to run, to warm up. So basically I'm telling it I want, I forget how many users. There's a lot of users. I think it's going to have 500 threads, and the ramp up is over 10 minutes. So it's ramping slowly. Okay? And so I'm going to go back to my talk while this gets going. So let's talk microservices. And does my laser pointer work? Excellent. Not so much. It did. There it goes. Okay. So I'm assuming since nobody raised their hand for doing microservices now, that means that most of you are writing what are called monolithic applications. Is that correct? So you'll have all those services combined into one big app and you roll them all out at once. Right? And that's the way I grew up writing apps. And I'm very comfortable with that. That's the way I tend to think about things. But I grew up writing apps about 15 years ago now. Right? And a lot has changed in the way computing is done in the last 15 years. And so it's kind of time for us to think in certain cases about changing to microservices. And what microservices means is instead of each of these little services being in one app, all bundled tightly together, you break them out into their own service like you saw there, where I have different endpoints for each of them, and that's actually a different JBoss EAP server. Right? That's not all different even services running in the same EAP. Those are all separate EAP servers. That's why my other two services stay up when that other one's down, because they're different services. And so there's a bunch of different advantages to this. So with this one, let's just say that yellow is high compute, and red is high throughput, right? So if my app starts getting swamped, I have to pick a machine that's best for both of them because they're on the same machine, right? You go to your Amazon instance or you go to your OpenStack instance and you say, well, I got that one machine because I got to average across all of these. And so you're spinning, and these services may not, let's say these two start to get throttled, the orange and the red, but blue and green, they're fine. They don't need more servers. Well, you're still spinning more of those up anyway, right? And it's more to maintain. It uses up more of the CPU. It uses up more of the memory on those machines. If you break things apart like this, you can actually pick the machines. Notice that the reds and the yellows are almost always together. So my analogy doesn't work so well. But the thing is, you can pick a machine that's appropriate for that service. You can say, all my yellows only get deployed to high CPU machines. And I need to make sure all my reds are only on database machines. And what you can actually do, these stand up by themselves, right? Notice they're separate blocks. This one, notice we've only spun up 3 greens. We've spun up 7, or I can't count, 5 yellows. Right? So you scale the services independently. So that's an advantage right there just from a hardware perspective. Right? And a durability perspective. Because if this app goes down, all the services go down. Nothing stays up. That's like the Amazon main web page goes down. How happy are they? No. They always, and so you can even do different levels of reliability with the different services. Okay, this is one of the take-home messages. Ready? I'm going to have 3 take-home messages. This is one. There are no requirements for languages or app servers. There's very little talk. If you go and read Fowler's original document on microservices, there is very little talk of technology at all. Okay, so how many of you, when you usually see a microservices talk, it's got some fancy new programming language on the end of it or some cool new data store? Is that usually what you see? You can shake your head yes or no. I promise not to bite. It's like talking about Akka or Node or you need to use Redis. You usually don't say, hey, use EAP. Am I right about that? Usually, right? Unless you're following some of our stuff. I'm using EAP, and it's fine. There's some disadvantages to using EAP, but it works fine. If your team knows EAP already, then use it. Microservices doesn't need a specific technology to bring advantage to you. Okay, so don't feel bad if somebody tells you something else. Like, oh, well, you're using EAP? Psh, you're not doing it. You're using Postgres? Oh, you're so not doing microservices. You can tell them, Steve says, kiss off. Okay? So there is no requirement. So how many of you actually didn't play with microservices yet because you thought you needed to learn Akka first, or you needed to learn Node first, or you needed to learn some new technology to play with microservices? Is that what held some people back? Anybody? Look, in our culture, this means yes, and this means no. How many people felt held back because they had to learn a new technology? This is you can raise your hand for now. Nobody felt bad about it. I find that hard to believe, but okay. I'm just going to call you all liars from now on. I can't count on any of your responses. All right. So this is the biggest part of microservices, and it's the hardest part. All right, and so we're going to start with the traditional team. Traditionally, in the monolithic, you have a bunch of UI specialists, and they work on the front end. And then you have a bunch of middleware specialists, and they work on the app servers, and they write all the services. And then you have DBAs, and they work here, and there's one, on the DB part, and there's one piece that's missing that I think Fowler should go back and add, which is there's a bunch of sysadmins, and they just work on the machines. Is that how most of you are set up right now at your companies? Thank you for following cultural norms. Okay, so this causes problems, right? Because how many times do each of these groups throw things over the walls to each other and say, well, it worked for me, or I did it like I was expected, or this group says, oh, I needed this to do X, Y, and Z when there's no way that the technology can do X, Y, and Z. Right? There's basically these huge communication chasms. These groups don't interact. Do they eat together? Usually not, right? Do they hang out together? No. There's these really big chasms. The Spotify is another big user of microservices, and they have a great blog talking about how they've reorganized their team. What you do with microservices is you have cross-functional teams. I would actually put a sysadmin in there. I think you need DevOps, however you want to define it, but you need someone who actually manages machines on the team who can help you with this stuff. It's great if you do this, but it's even better if you add a dev person in. And so then this team gets to own this service. And these people can be shared. Like, you can have people on two teams. You don't have to be one person. It's not a one-to-one relationship. But it is a team, and that team is responsible for that service. If that service goes down, who gets called? They do. If there's a bug, who gets called? They do. They own that service. The benefit, though, also is they get to choose the technology for that service, right? Because they're the owners, and it may be a limited suite. At your company, you may say, it's just Node, and it's just Java, and that's it. But within that world, that team, they get to pick the technologies they want to use, right? So this team may say, oh, you know what? We're the front-end team. We give them a lot of pictures. We're providing the pictures. This might be Node with Mongo or Redis or some sort of fancy caching service behind it, because that's a lot of high throughput, and that's the best solution for them. This team here, they manage money. So there's a lot of transactions. So these people, they're using Postgres because they don't want to pay all that money for Oracle, and then they're actually using some application server like JBoss, right? Because they don't want to pay all that money for all the other stuff too. But they're using a high transactional service. How fast do you think this team's sprint is? Long or short? It's a binary answer. This is, it's good. Short, exactly. Because they're iterating the front end, they're making really a lot of changes, they need to sprint fast. When you deal with money, how long are your sprints? Long. Because you make a mistake in there, bad things happen to lots of people. So these two teams can actually sprint differently too. Right? They don't have to be tied together like, this is the train and it leaves the station, and if you're not on it, your feature doesn't get in for the next 6 months. Right? Which happens are you laughing because that happens at your company? Yeah, exactly. You missed the train, you were a week from finishing, but oh well, too bad. Right? So you don't have that same problem because I can say, oh, I can do my service differently. So the hard parts. By far, and this is not just with microservices, this is life in general. Technology is relatively easy. Politics and people, that's hard. And the hardest part here is, and I will agree with Crockford on this, you can't have this organization and do microservices. It just won't work. Okay? You need I was talking to a customer the other day who was like, we're all in on microservices. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Why are you picking it? He's like, I want to give my teams independence. I was like, oh, you don't need the newest and great. No. We're keeping the technology all the same. I just need teams to have independence so they can own stuff and have flexibility and move faster. So there's many reasons why people accept microservices. It may not be for cloud, infinite scalability in the cloud and all these fancy. It's just, I'm sure all of you have been on the monolithic teams. How much fun is that compared to when you own the whole stack, like when you're hacking on something by yourself or with a couple friends? It's a lot more fun when you get to pick the technology, you're tied closer, you're talking to the DBA, or you do DBA work some of the time. It just feels better. And so that's what he wanted his teams to not keep throwing things over the wall to the sysadmins and be like, you broke it. It worked fine for me on my laptop, right? So, but getting teams to agree to breaking them up you're up against HR, right? So again, the best way to probably get started with this is some small group of like-minded individuals who can splinter off and work on some small project by themselves, get a success, and then share that with the rest of the company, right? And again, try to throw a sysadmin if you can. I don't have any really, I'm bad. Grant can tell you I'm very bad at politics. So I don't have much advice about that other than the one I gave. How do you test, deploy, and manage? So with the Monolithic app, I've got one server and I've got one JVM running, maybe two, maybe three, but that's it, right? So it's very easy for me to monitor my JVM. I just attach it, to the JVM, and there I am managing the JVM. And I don't have to worry about things going over the wire and all sorts of stuff like that. It's right there. Yeah, you have a question? You're just fixing your hair because you're jealous of my hairdo? Yeah. And how do you test it, right? With a Monolithic app, it's all together. Like, unit tests are great for Monolithic because it's all on the same server. Unit tests are okay in a microservices, but really it's higher up the chain where microservices really needs to be tested because you have all these services coming together, the integration tests and stuff. Deploying it, I don't just take one WAR file and slap it down on a server. Right? That's a pretty easy deploy model. This is different. But I will say one of the other reasons I've heard some of the companies I've talked to thinking about microservices is building their app takes them over a day to do. Right? The actual build process for their app is over a day. And that's you can't, what kind of agility can you have or testing can you have when it takes over a day for your app to build? Or how do you build that on your laptop? Right? So one of the other things they're doing is when you break things out into microservices, it's much easier because builds take a matter of minutes. So you can do this continuous deployment, continuous integration. But that is hard stuff. Stuff that you normally did before, move somewhere else. Yeah? Yes. Yes. So the point he was pointing out, the gentleman here was pointing out, that with a single app, everything's sharing memory, right? They're all on the same processor. There is a lot of shared stuff. And on a microservices, you're going out over the network. So it's more chatty. It's definitely delayed in certain ways, right? And I was going to bring this up later, or maybe I was going to bring it up here. Let's see. Is the next point that? No. But I was going to bring this up as the reason why you don't want to do microservices, right? I am not a microservices all things person, right? If I'm writing a financial application that's doing like quant trading, I'm not writing that in microservices, right? That's high volume calculations. Data has to be, like if I'm writing a big statistical application, that's not going to use microservices either because I don't want it to go out over the wire and come back in again, right? I want that memory being shared. So if you think that performance needs to happen, then that would be a place where you wouldn't go to microservices, right? What you may also do, though, is usually there's supporting things around that. You may move those pieces out and leave the really tight loop stuff integrated into, so you have a smaller ball of mud, right? Instead of having this humongous ball of mud, which does the calculations and the user interface and all that other stuff, you have this small one. It's for me. Then what you actually can do is have those pieces be loosely coupled to the thing that's doing all the hardcore stuff. Okay? Another hard part is untangling existing apps, right? Because all of you basically said, yes, you have monolithic apps now. What I've seen generally, there's a bunch of blog posts out on the web and everything that talk about this. What I've generally seen people do is either they're doing microservices in greenfield, right? Like, what's done is done. We're just going to leave it. That's why we love Red Hat for their 10-year support contract. And that's going to sit and just run there for 10 years, and we're only going to do it on greenfield. What I've also seen people do is start to chip away pieces, like isolate individual services that they can take out easily, move that as a piece. It's kind of like, what is that? Oh, I play with my kids. Pickup sticks, right? When you start with pickups, does everybody know what pickup sticks is? So you put all the sticks together, and then you have to pull them away without moving the others. You look for the isolated ones, and you pull those off first, right? And then that makes the problem space smaller and smaller. So start with some easy ones that you can pull off and then work from there. Oh, this is the point that I was saying before, right? But it's not right for all applications, okay? So that's the second, I think, take-home message. I think that is. Don't microservice all things. So if I hear someone coming out of this talk saying, oh my gosh, we're not doing microservices and all our stuff, we're the losers. No. Microservices is not right for everything, okay? There are certain places where it makes a lot of sense, and there's other places where it doesn't. So tools to help. I don't like how small my font is today, so I can make it a bit bigger. There, that's better. Tools to help, platform as a service. Shocker, the OpenShift guy says that platform as a service helps. Does everybody know that OpenShift is a platform as a service? Right? Yeah. Thank you for raising your hand and shaking your head. You get a gold star. The reason why it helps is because it's very easy to spin up services without having to talk to the sysadmins, it's very easy to configure and play and try different things. Teams can do things like try Node, decide that that's just for hipsters, and then go back to Perl, right? Just kidding. But they can basically try different ways of configuring their services very easily at a low cost. It also helps managing scaling up. So one of the things that people go to microservices for is the ability to scale pieces individually. And the platform as a service a lot of times can help with that. But I don't want to talk too much about that one, even though Grant will be upset with me and the rest of my team will be upset with me, because then I feel like it's a propaganda talk. Right? So I don't want to do too much propaganda. Was that a little enough that it didn't feel like propaganda? Just trust me, it helps. I would never go back to not having a PaaS as a developer anymore. Another thing is external services, and that could be either in a private or public cloud, but just something external to the app, like your Jenkins server and its own app. Your messaging service, instead of having it bundled into your app, maybe have the ops team manage a large messaging service, right? So that stays up with however many nines. Have some sort of messaging service there. Your continuous integration, or any of those things external to your application, so you're not managing them, and they can actually help you go better. So I like micro frameworks. I consider JAX-RS a micro framework in the Java land, right? Because it doesn't bring all the web UI stuff. It is just, here's how I'm going to write REST endpoints. Sinatra is the version in the Ruby world. So Rails is pretty opinionated and pretty heavyweight. Sinatra is just like JAX-RS. I'm going to write REST endpoints. Flask or Bottle in the Python world is the exact same thing. Node is already got Express and a bunch of other frameworks for doing the exact same thing, right? But those micro frameworks help. One, because everybody on your team, once you learn that framework, it's very easy for everybody to exchange code. But two, it makes the drudgery of writing REST endpoints pretty easy, okay? And API generators. So it turns out the new version of OpenShift, which will be launching this week, is basically a microservice. Have you heard that there's a new version of OpenShift? Just kidding. I know it's everywhere. It's basically a bunch of microservices itself. The PaaS itself is a bunch of microservices, and the API to that is actually generated using Swagger, right? So that basically the API to the services is the documentation and everything from it is generated from the code itself, right? So there's nobody handwriting documentation and all that stuff. Are you looking at me because it's not really? Are you ruining my story? Harrison? Harrison's on the engineering team. So Harrison rips right there. If you try out V3 and it sucks, that's the man you're going to throw, whose house you're going to egg. My understanding is that it's all using Swagger, and I've seen the Swagger API, and I've seen the emails talking about Swagger. So whatever you say is wrong. We actually use Swagger to auto-generate the APIs. And I think the reason why I think that's important is because your documentation lives in your code, and it's easy to test it. It's easier to work with it, right, rather than handwriting all that stuff. Any questions? Still good? Benefits, easier maintenance, right? So I don't have to understand the entire code base of that big app. This is one of the things, you know how I said that it was all decoupled and so it's harder to monitor? I still haven't come to a consensus on that, in that I've recently heard a good argument from Crockford and some others, that what you've taken in the monolithic app, there's a whole bunch of stuff trying to talk to each other, but it's all hidden inside of the app. So you don't actually know where all that coupling is. What microservices does is it takes that coupling and makes it explicit, because it's been pulled out from the app, and you actually have to see it and figure it out. Yes, Grant. Who cares about ops? Not if they're running a PaaS. Yes. So Grant's point was, wouldn't this be more of a maintenance burden for the ops team? Right? Because now instead of having 4 JVMs running, you might have 4,000 JVMs running. And so there's a Java bug, and you need to patch all the JVMs. You're not patching 4 machines anymore. If you're still living in the world of hand patching everything, microservices is not a good idea for you. Right? I mean, this stuff doesn't work by hand patching everything. Conquer that bridge first. That's why it said bring an ops person in, someone you've heard like, I think DevOps is the coolest thing. I want to find out some more about that. That's a good ally to get on your little tiger team, okay? Because this stuff needs automation. You can't deal with thousands of microservices and if you're just sitting there SSHing into each box individually and fixing things, okay? The other easier maintenance is because the teams usually work tighter together, it's easier for everybody to know the code base. So it's not like Grant goes on vacation, that piece of the application, which was just the user piece, no one knows about it, right? Because it's all one app now. That one service is the user piece, and he and I work together, so we probably both know that code base. It's also easier maintenance because I can bring down the user service or change the user service without touching anything else, right? So you notice that the user service was dead in my great example app as I intended, but the data entry piece and the game piece were still up, right? In a monolithic app, what would happen in that situation? The whole thing would be down, and I'd have even less demo to show you, right? So I can keep rebooting my user service while I'm trying to figure that out, and it doesn't affect anybody else. So I don't have to yell at the damn guys in whatever other team or they touched this code base and they chose the rollout on the weekend when I was supposed to go away, and now my stuff's not working. And no, your team owned that whole thing, and you should be able to do it yourselves. Easier communication. So what I like about this is that the whole team owns the whole chain, right? And so communication's easier because now you're eating lunch together. Now you're maybe sitting next to each other. Now you meet regularly and you're talking. It's not just, I'm going to go away for a couple weeks and then I'm going to give you something, right? So that generally breaks down communication barriers, generally. There's more team autonomy, but I already talked about that a bunch. But I don't think that should be underestimated, though. I think people may poo-poo that. I don't think that should actually be underestimated in terms of enabling teams. It's like treating you hire good people, hopefully. Treat them like adults and good people, right? Why is the person all the way up the tool chain, all the way up the organizational chart, making decisions about what's right for serving up images? Shouldn't that be the programmers and the sysadmins and the database people who actually live and breathe that every day? Right? Of course, it should still be a Red Hat product that you use to do that, but they should choose within the broad array of open source products that Red Hat has to offer. And then there's more automation of grunt work, right? So this is back to the going in and patching each JVM, right? Microservices, you definitely need DevOps as part of that picture. Some sort of DevOpsy model, which is a whole talk unto itself, and usually not for this crowd, since everybody here said they were developers except for this poor guy. So it gets you out of that grunt work, though. So even example of bringing in a PaaS, no one's making VMs for me anymore. I self-provision. I do all the work I want to do. It's very easy for me to restart servers. No one has to give me the right accounts with the right access to my log files. No one who likes doing that. Nobody does, right? So so there was one customer we were meeting with where to get a publicly addressable network address was like an act of God, right? There was like this many forms, and it had to go through so many different teams, and the main blocker was the security team. And so they said, okay, well, we're going to bring an OpenShift, and this is the script that's going to run every time we do a network address, and this is how it's going to publish to DNS. Can you just give us this part of the DNS namespace? And the network team said, oh, it's automated, no one's touching it by hand? Great, here you go. Right? Because like Chernobyl, everybody knows that Chernobyl was a human problem, not a technology problem, right? Yes? Most people? Yes or no? Because I'm going to have to give another learning lesson if most people didn't know that. Okay, didn't think you were going to be here either, but now you are. Okay, so Chernobyl, what happened was the operators decided, let's run it a little bit hotter. And so they pushed the rods in a bit farther, and it started to get too hot, and they messed with some other valve or something else like that, and then it bent the rods. And so then when they tried to pull it back, they couldn't anymore. Everything operated the way it was supposed to operate. People overrode stuff trying to do things that it wasn't supposed to do. And I don't know about you, but I've never done change mod 777-R on a directory. I've never, ever done that and screwed up or 611 on a directory, and then somehow, why isn't the web server working anymore? Right? So that's how automation actually helps, not just with grunt work, but preventing people from hurting themselves. Yes, Grant. Well, why don't you just talk to me afterwards? Go ahead. Yet he's the co-author on the talk. Just saying. Go ahead. Right. So here's what I've heard. There's some guidance out there. Like if you're just 2 or 3 people working on a project, you don't really need microservices. You don't need them. I still, even when I was building this app myself, it's still, in my head, I liked having all the services separated. So that when something went wrong, I didn't have to, which code base am I in and who's talking to what, where. Like it's much easier and cleaner for me in my head, but you don't really need it. If you're interested in the scalability aspects, yeah. So this app, one of the benefits of me making this as microservices is if the user, I'm not expecting a large peak in users signing up. Let's just say that stays, relatively constant over time of users signing up. But what happens is if each user, let's just say 1 in 5 users is a super user, and they start doing 100 or 10x of the number of records, that line stays flat, but my data entry starts going like this. Right? Or maybe like this, whatever. It's not going to stay flat like the users. So I want to be able to scale up data entry without having to touch my user service and paying, even though OpenShift's prices are quite reasonable and attractive to the modern developer, I don't want to necessarily pay for more containers than I have to use. Right? And in this case, like for example, my web server that's showing the flatfluffy.com, which is a terrible looking site, but it's there. That's just a small container running PHP. All of my EAP servers, they're all large with 2 gigs of RAM, and same with my database one. So, yeah?
So, the company I work with, we have started investing in SOA. SOA architecture model, service-oriented architecture.
Oh, SOA. Yep.
So,
good question.
We are stumbling around in that, and we have enterprise-level services that are based on business entities, for example, product and customer and so forth. What, in your opinion, would be, how would one determine what constitutes a microservice? Like, how to make that distinction between a micro and a microservice?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So he walked around a problem that's in his company, which is they're starting to do SOA. I'm saying this for the people who are watching the video later. Everybody else here heard? Yeah? Okay. I need to say it for the video people, though. You've got SOA already implemented, is that right? And so he's wondering, well, is those microservices? Or how do you define what's micro versus monolithic, right? Well, you call me in for a high consulting fee, and I will pass judgment over each of your services. That's probably not the answer you were hoping for. So there's a lot of debate in the community about what's micro versus macro, right? So everybody hear about Rastafarians? They're the people who, they took Fielding's paper on REST and were like, no, you're not using the protocol and the blah, 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 blah. And I was just like, I have no time for that. I need to get stuff done. There are some microservice-afarians who say one function per microservice. And I say, no freaking way, right? That's a waste of my time. So usually what it's decomposed into is things like users or products or something like that. But that sounds pretty close to your SOA stuff. One of the things which I agree with Mark Little about this is he pretty much rails on Fowler in our private discussions on email, which are now public on the video, about Fowler didn't acknowledge the heritage of SOA enough. And I think that's true, right? So this is where I'm in a tricky spot speaking at a Red Hat summit. To me, SOA is, if the analogy is SOA is to capital W web services, the really complicated stuff, as microservices is to REST. Does that make sense? Microservices and REST is kind of built from the ground, like it was an upswell, and SOA and capital W services was kind of down from the top, right? There were standards and specifications, and they kind of came down this way. I think they both have a place in your organization. It just depends on how much level of control your organization feels it needs over those tight services. You might expose that SOA bus as an endpoint into some of your microservices, right? It just depends. With all of this stuff, there's no, in case you haven't noticed, it's all things this way. Like, I hate those kind of talks. I hate those kinds of discussions. And so I think it depends.
So we went down, we tried to go down the path of microservices,
Yeah.
and all of our services are REST-based.
Yep.
They all host from the new service work,
Great.
but it got to a point where the SCA calls got ridiculously high because the chatter among themselves,
Was too much.
and we are trying to look at the NAS model and stuff now going forward, but we're not there yet.
Okay, so I don't know enough about I know that Fabric 8, I think, is very, very much into microservices, and there's discussions around that. So being as this is a Red Hat Summit, I feel like I can speak a bit more about our products than I would at another one. I would suggest going to their booth and talking specifically to them about that issue. I think one of the big benefit people from microservices is network manufacturers, because this is so chatty that you better have good networking machines. And I mean, you better have good networking hardware, even if that's an SDN where you're putting it on generic hardware. But this really requires good networking, right? So, yeah, it's chatty. So you may actually say, whoa, this can all be microservices. And this part, we're going to consolidate this because there's way too much chatter and it just kills our network given the hardware we have now. You'll still have gained the benefit of going some way down the microservices and pulling things apart. It's not an all or nothing, right? So.
Are you suggesting then that for better network performance, it's better to deploy OpenShift on Metal and other VMs?
No, that I'm not. Well, so the question was, should I deploy OpenShift on bare metal than VMs? Again, it depends, right? I mean, yes, I think it's fairly well agreed that if performance is the only metric you care about, then bare metal is going to be better for you, right? I just don't know how, the less layers you have between the CPU and what's running, the faster it can run in general. Speaking as a semi-technically literate person such as myself. So if you're running a financial quant application and you want to still use OpenShift with that, you think that's a good fit for it, you're probably going to want to run that on bare metal. But in general, it's kind of like premature optimization to say something like that, right? Like the gentleman behind you, they actually went and did it, and then they watched their network machines just like crumble, right? So no, don't start there. I would say start with the cheapest, best solution for your matrix of price, cost, performance, blah, blah, blah. And then if you have a problem, fix it from there. Does that make sense? Okay. And you had a question in the back.
Talking more on it, the question around SOA versus microservices would it not be sort of more fair to say that potentially the question is a false one, in as much that microservices, as you're articulating here, is about the team structure and the ownership of the service, and that typically the SOA coming out of the noughties didn't really have that concept of owning the service from a sysadmin right
All the way up. So that's one distinction. Another distinction is there's no enterprise service bus. SOA usually talks about a bus, right? There is no bus in microservices. There's messaging queues usually, or there's a Redis database where everybody's putting things into and reading things out. Like there's something, but it's not a bus that you publish to and then subscribe from. There's service discoveries. It's the model of centralized and controlled versus organic and growing more organically. But I think the idea of by going down SOA, you've already gone down a long way into decomposing your apps, right? Because I think when you do SOA, you've already broken out products and users, and this is the payment system. Like those are much easier to decompose than if you had those if you wanted to do that with microservices where it's using REST and you want to break apart the teams, it's easier to already get your team around that. Like who did most of the work on the user SOA piece, right? So yeah, I agree. It's somewhat of a false dichotomy. And it's a gradation between SOA and, like at what point does it stop being SOA and it starts being microservices? Again, a large consulting fee, and I will come to your architecture and tell you. Yeah?
Is that microservices is more related to or related to component services versus composite services? With component services being
Oh, component services versus composite service. So I think his point is microservices is more related to component services. Is that what you said? As compared to composite services, where a composite service is a bunch of services put together. So one of the slides I don't have in here that if you get to, sorry? Orchestrating services. One of the slides I don't have in here, because I tend to not to focus on that in here, in this talk, but Arun Gupta, he may be giving a talk on microservices, I don't know, and he likes to talk about this part. And Burr does sometimes too, Burr Sutter. But there's many different ways to put together microservices. Like my architecture, that's like stage 0, like the simplest kind of microservices you can do. Most often, if you're writing that mobile app, you're going to talk into some composting service that talks to all the services behind it, right? So microservices can still do that whole, I've got a suite of services that are talking into this one service that then talks out. That's one way people handle authentication. I'm going to try to end up using Keycloak here. I think that's a much more interesting model to, but.
So that component, that service that you're talking about in the center, that was at the Henry presentation. So that would be analogous to having an ESP in the center, where you could actually expose, I suppose, that coarse grain.
But I don't think it gets to the level of an ESB, right? Because an ESB is kind of the central, if I understand SOA correctly, which I may not, because that was one of the parts where I started checking out of the Java EE, where I was like, I want to just write simple apps, and this is way too much for me. But if I do understand this correctly, all services have to go in through the ESB, right? Here in the composting for Feed Henry or one of those other things, it may only be 3 services that you're using here. Then you have another composting, and that's a different 2 services that are going into that one, right? It's more like you have a bunch of Lego blocks, and you put them together the way you want them to work. All right, how are we doing on time? We have 12 minutes, is that right? Oh, this statement is why you might want to do microservices. This comes from my therapist. And this is another take-home message that I want, this is not even just for microservices, but I want everyone to think about this one because this is a great one. Clear boundaries, infinite possibilities. And what this means, well, I won't tell you what it means in my personal space, but what this means in a technology space is each of those microservices has a very clear boundary between them. This is our microservice. Our team is the user microservice. You who are doing the payment stuff, you do whatever you want. And in your space, you can use whatever technology you want. Your sysadmins can do whatever they want on their space. This is our space. And I have infinite possibilities about what I do in my space. And so there's nothing for us to argue about. You want to make an API call into me? I'll show you my API documents, and I'm going to tell you what I expect, or we'll talk a little bit about that. But once we agree on what the REST calls look like, we have no reason to politically infight and get into a whole bunch of drama. When you're a one big monolithic app, if one team decides to say, this whole app has to be written in Node.js, everybody has to get on board. And what happens then? Drama. Lots and lots of drama. And I'm too old for that now. So this is this clear boundaries, infinite possibilities. It's great if you do Node.js and I see it and I'm like, oh, that's really great. Maybe we should rewrite our service. But I'm not forced to be linked like that. Yeah?
When you create microservices, you still need to decide how they will communicate.
Yes.
You always have 2 teams that say, oh, we're going to use this technology, and some others will, oh, no, we want REST.
So no, I think the assumption in microservices is you're using either a message bus and you're probably using REST, right? You may have to discuss a little bit, are we going to use XML versus JSON? But I think in general, the world has pretty much settled on JSON, right? So yes, they will have to agree about how they talk to each other, but this isn't like SOA, where remember all those books that used to come out on .NET and Java interoperability for capital W web services? We're not in that world anymore. This is just HTTP requests with each other. So it's a pretty standard technology. Agreed, I have to say, when you do a post, your JSON body should look like this. And if you do that, I promise I'll give you back this. Is that enough? But that's the discussion we're having, rather than what technology are we using to get that part done. Does that make sense? We're going to skip this because we don't have enough time. I was going to talk about scaling and how scaling works. So some of the scaling hints, though, applies to microservices. So let's talk about some of those. Do you want to see the demo first? See if it's actually working? No. Everybody said no. I heard no. You guys said, I trust you. It's probably great. Okay, we'll keep doing this. Hold on. Let's just see if it's working. All right. So BlazeMeter is running. It's been running for a while. We're basically doing 8.43 hits per second. We have 2,000 users hitting that system. Okay, and we have a lot of errors. 3.41 per second. Expected because one whole service is down, right? What we can do here is, let's look at the aggregate reports. So here you can see each of the individual, well, you can't actually because it's so incredibly tiny. And this is one of the problems with it. Oh, now it's so incredibly tall, big, sorry. Here you can see, here's all the different endpoints that I'm actually hitting, right? So let's look for the one that's user, these two. So what we should see with those, except it doesn't scale responsively, they respond really quickly. Can anybody guess why? Because all they're returning is an error. But I can't get it to go any smaller now. So I can't show you the end column. But the error rate is probably incredibly high for that one. Monitoring. Right, so no, logs, no, errors. So there. We've gotten a lot of errors out of both of our user ones. Okay, so how do we actually, what kind of tools can we actually have to help us with this? If that actual service was entirely up, we could use, this is log entries. How many of you have heard of log entries? Have you heard of logly? The service logly. This is log entries. Very similar idea. It's basically a hosted, I enabled a service inside of my containers, and what they're doing is actually piping the log output to this software as a service. So it gives me one unified drain for all my logs, right? And so if we look at data entry, we should actually be, are we seeing anything at all? Live tail? Come on, really? I know, I tried to, they called me on it. None of it's showing, unless it's, no. Imagine, if you will, a whole bunch of log stuff spewing to the screen with each of the entries from what happened. And you can actually search on this by words. So I could do something like look for exceptions, right? That's what you would be seeing here had this worked properly. This is the hardest demo for me to give because this stuff seems to happen all the time. All right, so here's our queues. We have a bunch of different message queues. The user one will not be doing anything, but the new kills recorded should be doing something. So when a message comes in that a kill comes in, that actually publishes to the event queue, the event stream, saying, hey, I got a kill, and anybody can subscribe to that. And if this had been working, I'm pretty sure, I can't remember, where does it go to? Does it go to the user? No, it goes to the award. The award, no, it goes to the user, and it adds 1 to the user's total, right? So if the user service had been up, it subscribed to that new kill feed, and it said, oh, every time one comes in, I'm going to add 1 to the total for that one that user got, right? So that's that loose coupling. And that's the nice part also about the loose coupling is I don't think I'm getting errors in new kills. I might because the user service is up, and so it may not be able to, it might not have the user's IDs. But you can notice there you can see the number increment on new kills recorded, right? And so that can keep publishing even with the user service being down. And with a good message queue, what it'll actually do is the user service is down, it'll hold up all the messages until it can push them in. Iron IO does not do that at this point. The next version does. So my whole application is hosed right now. But in a good architected app that was more than a team of one, it would hold that all back, and then as soon as the user service came up, it would just push them all through. Right? So that's that loose coupling that you really need. Let's see if App Dynamics is. Oh, okay. Something's working. Thank goodness. This is App Dynamics. So this, if there was a user service up, you'd also see a green circle for my FF user, my user service. And what this is doing is it's showing, so here's the data entry one. Remember I said there's a queue coming off of it? So this is the data entry one. It's showing me that this is talking to a Postgres instance, and we're doing about 137 calls a minute. to the Postgres service, right? And it's taking about 103 milliseconds. You guys can't see this, but that's what I promise you. If you come up in, that's what you'll see. And then this is actually showing the HTTP request to the IronIO message queue. Right? And so this is the kind of dashboard you need when you start doing things like microservices. AppDynamics is one. Who's another one who does something like this? Everybody probably knows it. It's also another OpenShift partner. Yeah? Yes. But AppDynamics runs their own service. I'm using AppDynamics. I have agents on all of my EAP instances, and they publish out to AppDynamics from the log files. Who's another big company that does something like this? New Relic, right? So whether you architect and build one yourself in-house, or you use one of these software as a services, you're going to need something that looks like this, right? Because this actually, notice it says there's an error. It actually allows me to bury all the way down into transactions if I want to. So like this one. Oh, there's an error here on data entry. What's the error? Oh, okay, there. It's talking to the database, there's that error. 3 minutes? I don't need no stinking 3 minutes. There. It says, oh, there's the exception message I actually got. Right? Try doing that if there's like 3,000 servers running. This actually lets me start looking at some of the error messages. Oh, okay. Well, let me start now looking at my roadkill service, the data entry service, and seeing if I'm seeing a lot of those. Okay, what is it? Where am I digging in? So this is do you need it for the overall picture, but you also need it for actual being able to dig all the way down to what your errors are coming from. This is something that you need because you don't have that. I'm plugging into this one JVM and I get to see everything I want to see. 2 minutes. Yeah.
How Libre cannot react in licensing for microservices?
That's a great question for both of them in their booths. Okay, the only one I'm going to give about scaling and building here, avoid sessions. If you can avoid sessions, sessions are the bane of microservices and being able to scale. Okay, microservices has benefits with cloud-type applications. These patterns give more flexibility, resilience, and capacity. Used OpenShift to code rather than manage servers. Use AppDynamics to monitor, improve. Use BlazeMeter to drive and test. Use IronMQ as our message queue. Use log entries. This is in case remember, this is a web presentation. So these are all here in case you want to click on them and learn more. That's the only reason I'm going through them all. Okay, so what are the 3 take-home messages? I gave you 2. There's a third I didn't call out specifically. But what were the 2? Yeah, you actually get a platinum star because you've participated more than once. Clear boundaries, infinite possibilities. Some people will not be going on to the next grade next year. Exactly. Don't microservice all things. If you come out of this talk and say, I went to this great talk by the Steve Zero at Red Hat Summit, and he said I should microservice everything, so we have to do it here at our company, I will come beat you with a wet noodle. That is not the message I'm giving. Pick an application where it's appropriate and use it there. It's just another tool in your tool belt as a developer, okay? The third one, which I didn't call out specifically, is I said it right at the very beginning. It was one of the first few slides that were actual real slides rather than my agenda and stuff. This man took notes, and that's why he's going to pass the class. The rest of you slackers, I'll see you again next session. There is no technical requirements for running microservices. Are all of you Java developers, basically? No? I heard a no. Who said no? Are you a Perl developer? What are you if you're not a Java developer? Okay, you're all Java developers. I'm assuming since you're at our show, and I think this is a fairly good assumption, that you're either using Tomcat or, most likely, EAP. And is that a good assumption? Yes. You had to go and ruin it. Y'all see you next session too. Okay, so you are perfectly fine how you are. Use the tools and coding that you know now to explore this new technology. Do not say, oh, the only way I can do microservices is if I learn Akka. So I'm going to learn Akka and Scala and and eventing streams at the same time I learn microservices. Bad idea. You know tools already. Use those to do this architectural style, okay? Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Time's up. Oh, answer if there's a rating survey. Is there one, Mike? Is there some sort of survey or something you're supposed to do on the phone, in the app? If you can, and only if you like the talk, can you please vote on the talk? If you didn't enjoy the talk, there's a piece of paper that you can fill out over by the desk. I promise there's one there. Go ahead and fill that one out. But those who liked it, use the app to vote for the session, please. Thanks, everyone.